Snow fell in a slow, unbroken drift, burying the pines in white and muting the mountain's usual night sounds. Clara Whitlow's breath steamed in the air as she swung the axe into the last round of wood, the dull thud swallowed by the hush. The cold stung her cheeks, but she welcomed it. Work kept her from the thoughts that prowled when the world was still. She bent to gather the split pieces when she heard it. A crunching tread, uneven and light, too hesitant for a deer and too clumsy for a fox. She straightened, scanning the tree line. The pale wash of moonlight revealed only shadowed trunks. Then movement, a figure stumbling between the pines. Thin frame, hunched against the cold, coat torn at the sleeve. When the boy's face lifted, she saw eyes too pale for dark, wide with the animal wariness of something cornered. He faltered at the sight of her, as if deciding whether to turn back into the forest. But his knees buckled before he could choose. Though it slipped from her arms, pieces sinking soundlessly into the snow. She crossed the yard quickly, the packed drifts crunching beneath her boots. His hands were bare, skin cracked and bleeding, the nails rimmed with dirt. "On your feet," she said quietly, not unkindly. He shook his head, shivering so hard she could hear his teeth click. Pride kept his gaze averted. "Then lean on me." The boy resisted for a heartbeat, then let her take his weight. Together they crossed the porch, the lantern light painting his face in fleeting gold. She smelled the damp wool of his coat, the faint sourness of long hunger. Inside, the warmth of the stove hit them both like a tide. She eased him into the chair nearest the fire. Without a word, she ladled venison stew into a tin bowl and set it before him. He hesitated, eyes darting to the door, then to her, before lifting the spoon. The first mouthful seemed to burn him, but he didn't stop. Clara poured hot water into a basin and slid it near his feet. "Boots," she said. He obeyed, tugging them off to reveal threadbare socks clinging to his toes. She fetched a quill from the bed and laid it across his lap. "You got a name?" He hesitated, chewing. "Eli." "Eli what?" A shrug. "Just Eli." The way he said it told her there was more he wouldn't tell tonight. She left it there. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling the eaves. Clara sat across from him, mending a shirt by the lamplight. He ate until the bowl was empty, then set the spoon down with deliberate care, as though afraid of breaking it. His gaze roamed the room, the shelves lined with jars, the boots by the hearth, the rifle above the door, but always flicked back to the fire. "You live alone?" he asked at last. "Since my husband passed." Her voice held no invitation for further questions. His eyes lowered. "I can work," he said. "Chop wood, mend fences." "It's winter," she replied. "Not much to mend." He didn't answer. The quiet between them was neither easy nor strained, just a space each was learning how to share. After a while, she rose and pointed toward the ladder leading to the loft. "You'll sleep up there. Quilt's clean. Don't step too close to the stovepipe. It gets hot." He stood slowly, the quilt still over his shoulders, and climbed the ladder without looking back. She listened to the faint creak of the boards above as he settled in. The cabin returned to its usual quiet, but it felt altered, the air heavier somehow. She banked the fire, the orange glow dimming to embers. Outside, the snow kept falling. When she finally lay down, the wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of pine and something sharper, wood smoke not her own. She opened her eyes in the dark. From above, the boy shifted again, his steps light and deliberate, as though testing the floorboards. She held her breath, listening. A faint sound followed, a hinge easing open, the small loft window. Her pulse ticked faster. Was he leaving? Then came another sound, his voice, low and hurried, speaking to someone outside. She couldn't catch the words, only the urgency. The pause after was longer, and when she heard him close the window, it was with care. He descended the ladder a few minutes later, his tread noiseless. She kept her eyes closed as he moved toward the chair by the fire. The faint rasp of fabric told her he was wrapping himself tighter in the quilt. When his breathing evened, she opened her eyes to the shadowed ceiling above her bed, her mind fixed on a question she would not yet ask. Who was out there in the snow, And why did the boys speak to them as though they already knew his name? Snow sealed the mountain in white silence, the roads vanishing beneath drifts so deep they could swallow a wagon whole. Eli stayed because there was no leaving, and Clara told herself that was the only reason. Each morning, he appeared from the loft with hair mussed, face pale from the cold, and hands that always found some task before she could suggest one. The days took on a rhythm. She would find the woodpile higher than she'd left it, the kindling stacked so neatly it looked like a mason's wall. He repaired the latch on the hen house, mended a split in the water bucket, and cleared the snow from the roof without being asked. When she thanked him, his replies were a short nod or a quiet ma'am, as though words were currency he could not afford to spend. One afternoon, she found him standing by the creek, testing the ice with the toe of his boot. He glanced up at her approach, his expression unreadable, but she noticed the set of his jaw softened. She handed him a pair of wool gloves. "These will keep your fingers," she said. He took them without meeting her eyes, but later she saw him wearing them, the cuffs tucked into his sleeves. When the wind howled against the cabin, they worked side by side, she at the stove, stirring the pot, he by the table, carving kindling from split logs. The candlelight made the shadows sway across his face, and for the first time she noticed how the hollows in his cheeks had begun to fill. He caught her looking and glanced away quickly, jaw tightening. The sheriff came in early February. Amos Keating stood in her doorway, stamping snow from his boots, eyes narrowing at the sight of Eli. "That the boy you've taken in?" His voice was casual, but the weight behind it was not. "Winter don't leave much choice," Clara said. Amos stepped inside, gaze fixed on Eli. "I hear talk of a store broken down in Pine Ridge. Folks say a lanky blond fellow was seen running from it. You wouldn't know anything about that, son?" Eli didn't flinch, but his shoulders squared. "No, sir." Amos's eyes lingered a beat longer than was decent, then slid to Clara. "Keep your door locked." When he was gone, the silence felt heavier than the snow on the roof. Clara saw Eli's hands clench at his sides. "You got trouble I ought to know about?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." They left it at that, but the question stayed between them like smoke in the air. The gossip reached her through Martha Griggs, who arrived with flour and salt. "Town says you got yourself a boarder, and not the kind you'd take to supper." Martha smiled as if her words were harmless. Clara thanked her for the supplies and shut the door before her patience thinned. Eli must have heard. That night, he stayed outside until well past dark, splitting wood by lantern light. She watched from the window as he worked without pause, his breath coming in white bursts, his shoulders hunched as though bracing against more than the cold. By March, the cabin felt less like hers alone. His boots stood beside hers by the hearth. His coat hung on the same peg as her late husband's. He learned the small sounds of the place, the squeak of the third floorboard, the hiss when the kettle boiled over. She, in turn, learned the quiet ways he tried to repay her, the fire already lit before she rose, the buckets full before she asked. One evening, she found him in the loft mending a tear in the old quilt she'd given him. His stitches were crooked but careful. She climbed halfway up the ladder. "Didn't know you could sew," she said. He shrugged, eyes still on his work. "Figured I could learn." Her hand rested on the ladder rail a moment longer than necessary. "Looks fine to me." They shared a meal without hurry, the warmth from the stove blurring the edges of the long winter. Outside, the snow began to soften in the sun's longer reach, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth. That night, unable to sleep, Clara stepped onto the porch. Moonlight spilled over the drifts, turning the yard into a silver sea. Eli was there, leaning against a rail, his breath curling in the cold. He didn't startle when she joined him. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Too quiet." They stood together, listening to the distant creak of ice shifting on the creek. She found herself saying, "It doesn't feel as empty here anymore." He glanced at her, something flickering in his eyes, a gratitude so raw it was almost painful to see. Before he could answer, a sound carried through the stillness, the faint, unmistakable crunch of footsteps beyond the yard. Eli stiffened, his hand tightening on the porch rail. Clara followed his gaze toward the dark line of trees. where the snow lay unbroken, except for a single set of fresh tracks leading toward the cabin. The snow was loosening its grip on the mountain, shrinking back into the shadows of the pines. Patches of dark earth showed through in the yard, and the creek's voice grew louder each day. Clara watched the thaw from the porch, arms folded against a lingering bite of wind. Eli was in the orchard, turning the soil with a spade he'd sharpened himself, his coat hanging open now that the cold had eased. Sheriff Amos came up the path just after noon, boots squelching in the mud. His eyes cut to Eli before he even greeted her. "Need a word," he said, voice low. She stepped aside, letting him into the cabin. "There's talk down from Pine Ridge," Amos began. "A robbery last fall. Witness put a boy about his height at the scene." Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "Talk isn't proof." Amos glanced toward the window, where Eli's figure moved steadily between rows. "Maybe not, but it'd be a shame if trouble followed him here." When the sheriff left, she went to the orchard. "Amos says you're wanted for a robbery," she said. Eli straightened, the spade's blade sinking into the dirt. "I left those men before it happened. Didn't take a thing." His eyes didn't waver, but she saw the effort it cost him to hold her gaze. She nodded once. "Then that's enough for me." That night, the wind returned, carrying the rattle of sleet against the windows. Eli brought in extra wood, stacking it by the stove. She was settling the shutters when a shadow detached itself from the tree-lean. A man in a long coat, moving with the purpose of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Eli's face drained of color. "Stay inside," he murmured, stepping toward the door. The man mounted the porch without knocking. His voice was sharp, laced with familiarity. "Eli Carter, thought you'd vanished." Eli blocked the doorway. "I'm not going back." The stranger's gaze slid past him to Clara, measuring. "You think she's going to keep you? She don't know half of it." "I said I'm not going," Eli repeated. The man took a step forward, the wet boards creaking under his boots. "You owe us." Clara reached for the rifle on the wall, but Eli's hand went up, calm, deliberate. "Leave," he said. The man's lip curled. "Or what?" Eli didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his stance, body between Clara and the intruder. The air in the cabin seemed to tighten. Then the man lunged. Eli met him with a hard shove, sending him staggering back into the rail. Before the man could recover, a voice cut through the storm. "That's enough." Amos emerged from the darkness, revolver in hand. The stranger froze, then spat into the snow and back down the steps. "This ain't over," he muttered, retreating into the sleet until he vanished among the trees. Amos holstered his gun, eyes on Eli. "Looks like you made your choice." After the sheriff left, the cabin was quiet except for the hiss of the stove. Clara took Eli's hand, turning it over to see a fresh scrape across the knuckles. She cleaned it with warm water, the scent of soap rising between them. "You could have gone with him," she said softly. "I already have a place," he replied. Her gaze held his, and for the first time there was no guardedness in it. She laid her hand over his, not as thanks, but as something steadier, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had built through the long winter. The days that followed carried the scent of wet pine and thawed soil. In town, gossip shifted. Folks nodded at Eli when he passed, their curiosity tempered by Amos's quiet endorsement. Clara noticed how he moved now, not like someone ready to run, but like a man setting roots. On a warm morning in late spring, they worked side by side in the orchard, planting saplings. The earth was rich and dark, clinging to their hands. When they paused to rest, Eli looked toward the road, where a pair of townsfolk passed by in a wagon. He lifted a hand in greeting, then without ceremony said, "My wife and I are setting in good this year." Clara felt the words settle between them, not as a claim but as truth, earned without hurry. She didn't correct him. That night, the sky blushed gold before fading into a deep, still blue. They sat on the porch as the last light thinned, the orchard stretching quiet before them. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called, its voice carrying to the thawed air. Clara glanced at Eli, seeing not the half-starved boy from Winter's Edge, but the man who had stayed when leaving might have been easier. She thought of the stranger's promise that it wasn't over, and wondered if he was right. Somewhere out there, The snowmelt was feeding streams that ran far beyond these mountains, carrying with them the past they'd both tried to leave behind.